Mr. Chairman.
It'll come as little surprise to most of you that I don't like involving government in industry. I don't like involving government in almost anything, ever, particularly with regard to an industry that's grown up in freedom as opposed to regulatory captivity. It's not an easy thing for me to decide to involve government in ways that it hasn't previously been involved. But I have to say that during the last 6 months or so, we've seen some really, really egregious behavior by these two social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter. For a long time, I thought, look, it's difficult to operate a big social media giant. I'm sure it is. I continue to believe that. And I also would stop and think about the fact that, you know, they're not government actors. They are, in fact, corporate actors. They're not government. We don't manage them in the same way that we would a government enterprise. And nothing in this bill does that. We can't overlook the fact that time and time again, over the last several years, we've seen both of these entities doing two things that are mutually incompatible and irreconcilable. First, they say we're politically neutral. We don't tip the political scales. We may censor you if you're engaging in violent conduct, if you're actively advocating for the violent overthrow of the federal government, if you're threatening to kill somebody, things like that. But we don't tip the scales politically. That's fine if they want to do that. By the way, it's also their right if they decide not to do that. But what they can't do is to do that, and then number two, go on and do something completely different. Over the last 6 months, and particularly I would note over the last 2 months, during the exact same time period, coincidentally, as we've had 2 consecutive hearings with the CEOs of both of those companies on this very topic, one in the Commerce Committee, on which I serve, and one on this committee. We've seen a dramatic acceleration of both anecdotal and empirical evidence indicating that they're anything but politically neutral. Now look, again, as a for-profit business enterprise, they can do whatever they want. The First Amendment gives them that right, if that's what they want to do. But what they can't do is claim to be neutral, and also, by the way, benefit from the immunity they're granted under Section 230 without any modifications, while being anything but neutral. We have seen pro-life, conservative, Republican candidates, ads, organizations censored, demonetized, depreferenced, subjected to warning labels over and over and over again. Sometimes I would add, even in contexts that have nothing to do with the political issue in question, they'll still slap a little warning label on there, just to remind us who they are, what they stand for. There again, that's their right, but it's not their right to do that while claiming that they're politically neutral. Those two things cannot exist in the same universe at the same time. When they've come before us, as I've asked them questions about this, I've asked the CEOs of both companies questions. You know, in response to our concerns, they will tell us things like the following. Everybody's upset by this. We've got our enemies both on the left and on the right. Everybody feels like they've been gouged by this. But I asked them both several questions with regard to whether they could name a single Republican, conservative, or pro-life entity, individual, or candidate who had been comparably gouged, comparably demonetized, deplatformed, or had their advertisements removed, in the same way that we've seen a number of prominent examples on the right. In basically every instance, they couldn't. They had to struggle to do it. They both said, yeah, we'll get you something on that, and later struggled to identify things that could be described as on both ends of the political spectrum. But they can't, because they're not there. I think everyone in this room could identify 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 prominent Republican examples of where that has happened. Some of them are even in this room that have fallen victim to that. And yet they can't name from the top of their head, from their own memory, one single example of where this has happened on the left. This is a problem. I think this legislation does a lot to help that issue. And it would allow companies to preserve their Section 230 protection and censor their users as they see fit, as long as they do so in accordance with their own published transparent terms of service. That's why, notwithstanding the fact that I've had some concerns with the bill over time, Chairman Graham has worked with me closely. He's generously agreed to make changes to resolve a number of my concerns. I'm going to continue working with him as we approach the floor on this, but I support that. I've also recently introduced a related piece of legislation called the Promise Act, S. 4975. The Promise Act basically makes clear what I think is already consistent with the spirit, if not also the letter of the law, under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, making clear that if they claim to be neutral, they've got to act in a manner in conformity therewith. If they claim to be neutral, they've got to be neutral in a way that is reflective of their own terms of service and their own statements by their own corporate executives. I've been really patient with these tech platforms because I don't like government getting involved. They've made it impossible for us to ignore. I'm disappointed by that, and frankly, I resent it. That's why I'm supporting this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.